Hey guys, it's Bree here at Blossom and Branch Farm. If you're a backyard gardener or a small market farmer, what I do here is going to help you figure out how to space save. Today, I'm going to be taking you through my greenhouse and answering most of my frequently asked questions about it. Let's go. If you've been following me for a while, you know that we grow in this 6x8 greenhouse. Now, considering that we have about an acre of market farm going on, that's not a very big greenhouse. Most growers have much more space, but there's a reason that I like this small one, and that is mostly because it's cheap to keep operating. Bigger greenhouses, more expense to heat, and also just more energy use. This small one, while it's only 6x8, I have learned to conserve a lot of space. Of course, I consider myself very lucky to be able to have a greenhouse space to grow in at all, because when I started out, I did all of my seed starting inside in my basement. And in fact, I have a video that I did last spring where I showed how to set up an indoor seed starting space in your basement if you don't have any outside light and all you have is a rack and lights. So if that's your circumstance, you can go and check that video out. But also, you might learn something from today's video. We're going to talk about the trays we use to conserve space, the lights that we use, and what kind of heat. So let's do a quick little tour. You can see here, these are wire baking racks. They're adjustable. I can change them. I can take them apart. I also use them in my cooler. I use them to stack buckets. I can use them in a storage room. I like that they're flexible, adjustable depending on the season. And then I also can put them pretty close. And I do this again for space conservation. So you can see the distance between this shelf and this shelf is maybe about 10 inches, not very much at all, but that's enough for me to get a tray of soil blocks in there. We're going to talk about my trays next. Just for example's sake, let's say that I've got a tray here, and right now I have a wood tray. For the sake of example, we'll pretend that we're using a soil block, and we've got the tray right here. You can see there's plenty of space for a seedling to grow and to put a light on the shelf. So by doing them this close together, I can actually fit 1, 2, 3 rows of seedlings here in my greenhouse. So let me load the shelves up and show you what they would look like with the trays that I use. Now, if you've watched our soil blocking videos before, you know that we use fiberglass trays. I started using them because there was a restaurant down the street that was going out of business, and they had a bunch of these trays sitting outside, and I said, hey, can I grab those? And they said, sure, and they charged me $1 for each of them. So I bought all of them, and at the time I actually didn't know this, but I had an inkling that possibly my soil blockers would fit perfectly on these trays. We're going to talk more about this next week, so I'm not going to get too into it right now, but they do. They fit perfectly on these trays, so that's why I use these. Now I start 14,000 seedlings in here, guys, just to give you an idea of how much I'm talking about space conservation. I do put my trays in here 2 deep. I've got one, and then I've got another one. Now, it's best if you can actually line up these shelves. I need to come in and readjust this shelf. It's best if you can get them to be continuous, but this way I can fit 2 of these on here, and then sometimes if it's really, really crowded in here, I'll even have 2 more going this way. So at this point, if I'm using the mini soil blocker, which looks something like this, again, we're gonna be talking about all this next week, but if I'm using these on these trays, I can fit 280 seedlings on one tray. So that's on one shelf. I'm looking at 1,000 seedlings right there. So just to give you an idea of how I'm able to really, really maximize space using both the soil blocks, these trays, and this shelf combination, that's how I do it. Let's talk about lights next, because lights is another big question that I get. What kind of light do you use? Well, get ready for this fancy thing. I just use LED shop lights. Very run-of-the-mill. I get these at Costco, and these are just LED shop lights, very basic. And people think that you need fancy grow lights to grow seedlings. You don't. I never have used them. My seedlings look fine, and even when I grow inside, like I mentioned, I grew all of my seedlings inside last year, and the first couple years we were growing here at the farm, they work just fine. The trick is to keep the shop light close to the top of the seedling, so you don't want it too high. So I'm gonna hang one of these on the shelf and show you about what height I would put it at. So because I'm using these wire shelves, it makes it really easy to hang these lights. I actually just use, usually this is like a craft paper wire. It's the same one I use for flower arranging, actually, to wrap my bouquets. That's all I use, and I make them nice and long so that I can adjust the level of the light depending on how tall my seedlings are. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this light on so that you can see what that looks like. I do 2 of these lights on each shelf. You can see that these are just the perfect size to have one in the back, so I'll put this one back there, and then one right in front of that one. So this is gonna give nice, even light all the way across this shelf. And the reason that I use the lights, even though I'm in an outdoor greenhouse, is because it is still January, early January. I'm getting ready to start my lisianthus, my sweet peas. Gonna be doing my snapdragons soon and my onions as well. And so I am starting now, but the sun hours are not enough right now for seedlings to be growing and thriving. So we do need to supplement a little bit with some additional light. I'm only putting them on the lower rack. So I'm only gonna light this shelf, and then if it gets really full in here and I have to put anything on the lower one, I'll light that one as well. And that's because, as you can see, once we put stuff on top, it shades the light on the shelf below it. So this top shelf does not get lights. I don't light this one up here because it gets the most natural light. And I also don't put anything up on this top shelf unless I have to, unless it's very, very crowded, because again, not only is it gonna be shading out what's underneath it, but because I don't have lights suspended up above this top shelf. I hope that made sense. All right, so let's just get these wired on. For the sake of example, just tie in this guy. Again, really simply with the wire, and then that way I can just adjust them up and down. Very simple. I don't like getting complicated lights that are made for only one type of seed starting setup, because I'm always changing heights and sizes of trays and all that stuff. All right, now I'll tie up the other side. Now, key when you're doing a lot of lights is to get the kinds that can plug into each other so you can run a bunch of them on one circuit. There is a limit to how many you can put on one circuit. I think maybe it's 6 or 8. So plan for that. So you'll only be able to link so many together. Let's get these ones up. And this is the nice thing again about these shelves, is not only are they supporting my seedlings, but they're also supporting my lights. So I can just really easily tie the lights on. There we go. So if I need to move the lights up, I just shorten up the wire and then I just twist it. So quick and easy. And then once it's time to lower them, I just untie it. And then that way I can just quickly lower them. Now the one downside of the LED shop lights is when they do burn out, that's kind of it. So unlike a bulb that you can replace, you can't replace these bulbs. So thankfully, most of them have lasted me 4 years, but I do still test them every year just to make sure they're still working. Okay, my last tip on the lights is don't put them all in at once and then try to plug them together. Plug them in as you go so that you know that you have the right wires on the right ends so that you can plug them in a continuous circuit. Otherwise, you make it to the end and realize that your wires, your plugs, and your male and your females are on the wrong ends, if that makes sense. And that's especially important for me because I'm doing a long line of them, so I have to make sure that I can plug one into the next. So those are the lights. That's how close I have them to my shelves and to my trays. Okay, the next big question I get is heat. So I mentioned that the reason that I like to use this smaller greenhouse is because it's so much easier to heat. If I had even a 4-foot bigger greenhouse, right now I'm heating 48 square feet, 6 by 8. If I had even a 10 by 10, I'd be heating 100 square feet, and that gets expensive quickly, especially if you're using electric like I am now. There are other options for heat. Some people use propane, some people even use wood pellet stoves. Electric is just the easiest for me, and we have it running off of our solar grid. I have 2 types of greenhouse heaters that I like. One of them has worked pretty consistently. One of them I've had some issues with. This one has been the most consistent for me so far. This is Bio Green, and they are both greenhouse rated, which means that they're rated for use in moist environments. So you want to make sure that you get a greenhouse heater. Don't use a regular space heater in your greenhouse. I have one going all the time. This one just has a up and down basically. So I usually just turn it all the way up, and then I have it on the heat setting. Now, I do have it plugged into a thermocoupler. So a thermocoupler is just a fancy word for a thermometer that turns on when the temperature drops below a certain level. So this is my thermocoupler. This is also by BioGreen, and it has a thermometer here on one end. Boop, it just looks like that. And then this is where you plug in the heater. So I plug my heater right into here, and then I set it for a temperature. The temperature that I set it for depends on what I have growing in here. Now this time of year, I'm getting ready to start all my cool season things. So things like sweet peas, snapdragons, lisianthus, onions, things that don't mind cold temperatures. So I'm gonna set that temperature for lower than I would, for example, when I have things like tomatoes and peppers started in here, which really prefer warmer temperatures. The other thing I do when I do start having warmer things in here is I put those warmer things on this end of the greenhouse nearer to my space heaters, where on the other end of the greenhouse, I put the things that really prefer cool, because that end is going to stay colder the further away from the heater it is. So this time of year when I have my cool season things going, I'm gonna set my thermocoupler for about 40 degrees. So if it gets down to 40 degrees on this end where the thermometer is, that space heater is going to kick on. And that one for a greenhouse this size usually is enough, unless it drops down very, very cold. If we're getting into the single digits, then I add a second space heater. And that second space heater that I use is called Dr. Heater. And I've had two of these. One of them went out and I had to replace a part. So a little sketchy on that, on the quality, but I have had it for 4 years now. So I've gotten a lot of use out of it. So I've got both those space heaters down here on this end, just closer to the electrical outlets. If possible, you want to avoid plugging your space heater into an extension cord, but that might not always be possible in a greenhouse situation. So do what you gotta do, you know what I'm saying? But if you have to use an extension cord, please use an outdoor rated, make sure it's heavy gauge and no frays. Make sure they haven't been chewed on or nibbled on by rats or that kind of thing. Now later in the season, when it starts getting a little bit warmer, the benefit is that usually the nights are warmer and then I'm not having to heat quite as much. So by the time I get things like tomatoes and peppers in here, usually it's warmed up a bit, but I do still have my backup space heater in here so that if anything happens, if one of them goes out, I still have a backup. And pro tip, run both of them on separate cords, because if all of your power goes out and you have both your space heaters on one cord, you have no heat in your greenhouse and you might lose all your seedlings. Not that that's ever happened to me before. Two separate cords, two separate space heaters. That's my recommendation if you're having to heat a greenhouse in a cold zone like I am. The other heat thing that I like to use is a mat. And you've probably seen a heat mat before. They are very nice when you're starting things like lisianthus. Now the snapdragons actually don't like these, and the sweet peas don't like them either. In fact, the sweet peas like cold temperatures. We're gonna talk about that in our next video, starting sweet peas. But certain things do really like these heat mats. So I just use these basic ones. I do have the little thermometer gauge that comes with these. It's really not even that much more to get these ones that have this. But when you plug this in, this also has a thermometer on one end. So you can plug this in and you can tell it what soil temperature you want this to be. So in theory, you could stick this into your soil. So you could set, for example, say we're doing tomatoes that like at least 60-degree soil temperature. You could set this to 60 and the heat mat would regulate it to that temperature. So it's much nicer than just these plain ones that are just plug and go, because sometimes it can be too hot, sometimes they can be too cold. Get the one, spring for the one that has temperature regulation, especially if you're starting in an outdoor greenhouse, because our temperature fluctuations can be extreme and a heat mat can really help with that. So I can set this guy to kick on only if it gets to a certain temperature or below. I'll put the link down below for these mats. I wanted to show the layout of the greenhouse as well, because I really maximize space with the shelving that I do fit in here. So I mentioned that I like to use the wire racks, and I have calculated exactly how long those racks should be to fit exactly within my 8 feet of space here. So I made sure when I was ordering the shelves that I didn't have any awkward space left over on either side, except for over here, because I don't have this space filled yet back here, but I will. So a couple things you could do. This is the north wall of our greenhouse, so we could put a big black barrel in here and fill it with water and use that to retain heat. I've done that before in the past, but this year I'm actually going to be storing my seed starting soil back here. So I'll put my metal bin back here, and we have a new seed starting soil recipe that is easier and cheaper than last year's. I'm gonna be showing it here this week, so keep an eye out for that. But that's what's gonna go here. I mixed up a big batch and I'm gonna keep it right here in the bin. But then you can see I've got the rest of this space all the way filled. Now that being said, I do leave a nice space for a walkway here, because even though it might not seem like it, once I have a lot of seeds in here, and especially if it's very crowded and I have to run my trays longwise coming out of these shelves, like so, then you can see it does get quite narrow in here. And when I'm all bundled up and I have my big heavy overalls on in the winter, then sometimes I'll turn around and I'll knock things. So I do like to have a nice space in the middle and also for working. Now I also have my wood trays in here. So we already talked about the fiberglass trays, and we're going to be showing more of these again this week, but these are the wood trays that we've also been using, and I do love using these for things like tomatoes. I've grown a lot of different things in these wood trays. You can see these also fit perfectly on these shelves, and I had my husband help me plan to build them actually exactly for this size for that reason, so they fit right on these shelves. But they are pretty big and heavy. You may consider using a smaller tray, so a smaller wood tray, something like this one is much more manageable. It's much lighter when it's filled with soil, and we have this plan coming out for you to download in PDF as well. So keep an eye out for that. All right, let's take a look at some of the accessories I have here in the greenhouse. I do want to point out the floor in here first. So you'll see the floor in our greenhouse is actually brick, and that was intentional. Number one, we had a lot of brick left over from our house. There's a lot of this brick laying around, and so we use that. It not only is aesthetically pleasing, and it's nice and easy to vacuum, and it's a stable surface to walk on, it's also passive heat. So the bricks do absorb some heat during the day from the light of the sun, and then at night they release that heat. So it does help keep the temperature somewhat warmer. That being said, you're still gonna need heat. It doesn't substitute for heat. All right, let's take a look at some of the fun little things I've got in here, and then we're gonna wrap it up. All right, so we've already shown the trays. I just wanted to show them one more time up close. Again, these are fiberglass. We have a couple different sizes we recommend. This is kind of an 8 by 10, about the size of a piece of paper. Now it's not perfect if you're soil blocking. They do fit on there quite well. Not as perfect as the other ones. There's a little bit of space, but that's okay because that's a great channel for pouring your water into for soil blocking. So we can fit 4 on one of these trays. So these are the trays. I keep a big stack in here. And then these are the bigger trays. So these are the ones that I mentioned I got, and I'll put them in the description below. But you can see fiberglass. These are actually made in Pennsylvania, probably quite a while ago. But they are very, very sturdy. So I could literally fill this whole thing with soil and still hold it with one hand and it will not buckle. So that is rare in a seed tray. And then some other things I keep in here are some of my seed starting materials. So I've got some vermiculite here. I've got wool pellets here. These wool pellets have actually been sifted. And so you can see the texture that they take on. This becomes easier to mix in to a seed starting mix to add nitrogen or moisture retention. So things that really need a lot of moisture or a lot of food as they're growing. Use the wool pellets. And again, we're gonna be showing that whole new seed starting recipe here coming up. I always keep my transplant, my root inoculum mycorrhiza in here. I like to rub it on my seeds or put it into the little hole as I'm planting. I've got a tray here for mixing up soil for my soil blocks. So I meant to show Sugiban this one like we do our usual seed trays, but I didn't quite char it deeply enough. I need to come back and re-char this one. But that being said, we've got our soil in here, and you can see I just mix it. And I've been mixing this year in these wood trays. Now I did make sure that this is a nice tight seam. You can see here's the seam between the 2 pieces of wood. It's pretty tight, but what's nice about using this is it does let any excess water out the bottom. So if it leaks, I can put another tray underneath to catch any extra water. And in the meantime, this wood tray kind of absorbs any extra water, so it lets me keep my soil blocking mix just right. Unlike usual, where it gets too wet, and then I have to pour off a little water as I go. This one keeps just the right amount of moisture for soil blocking, so that's been great. Over here I have some soil blocks with a little trick. I'm gonna be showing you that this week for sweet peas. Some more wool pellets here. These ones are unsifted. So I mentioned the other ones had been sifted. These ones are not sifted, so you can see they're kind of chunkier, so a little bit harder to mix in, especially for mini soil blocks like these ones. I've got all my blockers here, so I've got my mini, I've got my large, depending on what I'm starting, and my medium. Again, if you're just starting out with soil blocking, guys, get this one. The Mama Bear soil blocker, it's the medium. She makes 5 at once, it's the perfect size. And I do keep them on this tray. I don't like to keep them in the wet soil because that'll make them rust. So I like to keep them on this tray. I've got a little jar that I use for measuring out my seed starting ratio. I have a sifter in here, but I have not been sifting this year with my new mix. If you're using the old mix that uses the Coco Loco potting soil, the sifter is helpful. Or if you're using homemade compost, the sifter is helpful too, just for sifting the big chunks out of your seed starting soil, because big chunks in seed starting soil is not ideal. I've got a bucket of coconut coir down here, a couple extra kind of buckets and containers just for mixing things. I've got toothpicks. These are key for seed starting, especially small seeds. You just lick one end of a toothpick and then use it to pick up your seed. I've got a Sharpie because I use a Sharpie to label these trays. So usually what I do is I label directly on the tray. You can see here, this was a Madame Butterfly Bronze. It's been Sun-Cold Tomatoes before. So I'll just label right onto here, and then you can just use a little bit of acetone to take off that Sharpie for the next year. So my greenhouse, as you can see, is glass and not polycarbonate. That is purposeful. And the biggest reason for that, just from a sustainability standpoint, is because I prefer to not use a lot of plastic in my garden space. You guys probably already know that. I try to minimize it as much as I can in both my home and my garden. So there are pros and cons of using glass over using polycarbonate. And the biggest one is obviously glass is breakable. Polycarbonate is also breakable, but it's not going to make as much of a mess in your garden unless you're factoring in the microplastic mess it might leave. But the glass, we have pretty big hailstorms here in Colorado. It's never broken. It is of course tempered, so if it did, it would shatter and hopefully not be jagged pieces, but it's going to last much longer. So polycarbonate usually has a bit of a lifespan. So because of the UV exposure, you know how plastic gets brittle over time with UV light? That's what happens with greenhouses. You can see they get a little bit filmy, they stop transmitting light very well. At that point, tend to shatter and break really easily. So that's kind of what we wanted to avoid. We were going for longevity with this glass. Now that being said, glass is typically more expensive. We happen to get this one secondhand, and people always ask me what brand it is. I'm so sorry. I can't link it. I can't send you to a website to buy it because they don't sell these in the US anymore. When we got it, it was on clearance, and it was a Juliana from Denmark. They don't sell in the US, but I see those greenhouses at Costco every year. Supposedly they do okay. They are cedar. Greenhouses from Costco also don't have windows that go all the way down. So if you look at my greenhouse, the windows actually go all the way down. And so what that allows me to do is to capture this lower growing space as well. So I'm not limited to just this upper shelf space. And that's why I do shelves. And yeah, that's it for my little greenhouse tour. So again, it's small, but we really figured out how to maximize the space so that during the growing season, I can have so many seeds in here. So let's count really quickly how many seeds I can have in this space. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 shelves in here right now. And again, I mentioned if I'm using the minis, I can fit 1,000 seeds on each shelf. So that is 13,000 seeds that I can have going in here at one time. Now, usually I don't have that many going at one time. I actually split it up into spring and warmer seasons. So usually my early stuff gets planted out 6 to 8 weeks before last frost. That's things like the sweet peas, feverfew, chamomile, lisianthus, bells of Ireland, poppies. All those things can go out 8 weeks before my last frost. And then I can start my warm season things like zinnias, peppers, tomatoes. So there's not always an overlap where I have that many seeds going at one time, but if I had to, I could. And instead, usually it's more like maybe 5,000 to 6,000 at one time. So it's a lot. Now that being said, I'm not sure that I'm going to be growing that many at once this year, just because I have a lot of perennials now that we've been switching the field to mostly perennials and a lot of natives. I'm not having to seed start as much, but we do still start around 2,000 lisianthus, all of our tomatoes, all of our onions, our snapdragons, sweet peas, poppies, foxglove. So there are still things that I am seed starting a lot of. And that's how I maximize my space, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. It is cold. We've got a snowstorm coming in, so I'm gonna go pack the sheep in for the night. And I hope you enjoyed it, guys. If you did, remember to like and subscribe. It means a lot to me and to all of us here at the farm. And don't forget, we've got our sweet pea starting video and our peat-free new seed starting recipe coming up this week. So don't forget to stay tuned for that. See you guys around here next time at the farm.